A human individual contains 23 pairs of chromosomes that are distinguished as 22 pairs of autosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. A female individual would typically obtain 2 X chromosomes, while a male individual would obtain 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. The terms dominant and recessive are useful for explaining autosomal inheritance patterns and means of alleles that are passed on from parents to offspring. 2 common modes of autosomal inheritance patterns are categorized as dominant or recessive. When we describe an allele as being dominant, it means that only one allele is sufficient to induce that phenotype. So a certain trait or a disorder that follows an autosomal recessive inheritance pattern has an associated gene that can be represented by either a functional allele and/or a non-functional allele. For example, the condition cystic fibrosis is represented by CF in uppercase letters, which is the functional allele, and CF in lowercase letters, which is the non-functional allele. An individual who inherits this disorder must be a homozygote recessive, in which they would need 2 non-functional alleles to be affected by symptoms. On the other hand, an autosomal dominant inheritance pattern follows the case in which inheriting 1 allele is enough to cause the phenotypic expression of that trait or disease in an individual. This in turn affects individuals in every subsequent generation once it has been initially introduced. An example of a condition that follows this inheritance pattern is Huntington's disease, where the associated gene can be referred to as HD. In this case, HD in lowercase letters represents the functional allele that has no symptoms, while both a heterozygote and a dominant homozygote would phenotypically express symptoms, such as uppercase HD and lowercase HD, or 2 uppercase HD. So this pattern exudes how only one allele, which is the dominant one, is enough to affect an individual.
A recessive trait that is passed on by the X chromosome has a dominant-like allele effect for males. Males have a higher susceptibility in inheriting a disease or condition that follows an X-linked pattern because they have a higher probability of receiving a faulty allele from their mother. Therefore, there is a higher prevalence of disease in males, such as hemophilia, that is passed on in generations. When passing on defective alleles, only affected fathers can pass on their diseases to their daughters. It is not possible for a father to pass on the trait to their sons. For mothers who carry their trait, their sons have a probability of being affected or not being affected. They cannot be carriers, while their daughters, depending on the inheritance pattern and the status of the father, can be unaffected carriers or affected. Since women have 2 copies of an X chromosome, in the case of a recessive disorder, they require 2 copies of the defective gene to display the phenotype. However, in the case of males, as they only have 1 copy, a single defective X chromosome is sufficient. In the case of dominant X-linked disorders, only 1 copy is required for females to display the affected phenotype, while males still require 1 defective copy to be affected. Males display a dominant inheritance pattern regardless of the type of X-linked disorder, as they can never be carriers under any circumstance. The difference between males and females inheritance pattern can cause difficulties when classifying and diagnosing diseases.
The terms recessive and dominant both have their places in genetics and can be very useful in simplifying and describing how the inheritance of certain diseases works. However, as we discussed, in the case of X-linked diseases, we come across issues, especially when describing their inheritance patterns in males. To recap the key points, recessive inheritance means that in order to be affected, 2 copies of the allele are needed. Dominant inheritance means that only a single affected copy is needed. And X-linked inheritance means that men are affected if they inherit an affected copy, even if the disease can be considered recessive or dominant in women. When it comes to X-linked inheritance, it's best if we steer clear from these terms as much as possible, especially when first learning about them.